So welcome everybody, and thanks to be here for this first lecture of the Strand Digital and Public History of the VDPH Summer Camp 2020. My name is Carlo Arrighi. I'm a PhD member of the Center for Digital and Public Humanities. Before I introduce you to today's speaker, Stefano Dall'Aglio, I've just some practical informations. During the talk, I would like to ask you to please put your microphone on mute. You have to click on the screen and then a bar appears on the bottom of your screen where you can activate and deactivate microphone and camera. Please keep in mind, we make a record of this lecture and we put this online on the VEDPH YouTube channel. Okay, this as much as for the practical instructions. I would like to briefly introduce you to Stefano Dall'Aglio, and then we can start with the two-day lecture. Stefano is assistant professor of early mid-modern history at Foscari University of Venice, where he teaches public history. He is a staff member of the Venice Center for Digital and Public Humanities. He has published widely on the political and religious history of Renaissance Florence and Italy, and he's currently working on the digital online edition of newly discovered letters written in Florence in the late 17th century. So, the title of today's lecture is Public History in a Time of Crisis. Stefano, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlo, and good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to finally kick off the second strand of the summer camp of the Venice Center for Digital and Public Humanities. As many of you know, we've been restructuring completely our originally planned summer course, which was supposed to take physically place in Venice. Of course, with the COVID emergency, we have to entirely rethink our program. We're now completely virtual. And in the wake of this transformation, I've also had to restructure, rethink the class I was expected to give. I was supposed to give a more general introduction to public history in a longer class, but of course now I'm offering a different type of talk. Basically, I try to establish some sort of relationship between public history and the emergency, the difficult times we are going through. So this is how the idea of this class came to my mind. And basically today I'm going to try to answer the question of what happens to public history when public spaces don't exist anymore. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. Thank you very much for being here. And now I will start with the proper presentation and with the slides. Okay, so public history in a time of crisis. What are we talking about today? First of all, public history, because of course this is a course on digital public history. And what I want to focus on, first of all, is trying as much as possible to find a definition of public history, which is not easy. It's almost impossible to find a definition of public history. Many courses just began trying to find a definition, the history outside of the class, the history in non-academic context, the history with the public, in the public, for the public. There is one definition given on the website on the National Council on Public History, according to which public history is, it's the same definition given by the Supreme Court of Justice of the United States in 1964, according to which, for pornography, according to which it is, well, I recognize it when I see it. I know how it is when I see it, which is a non-definition, of course. It's almost impossible to define it. So taking advantage of this non-definition, today I'll try to see public history as an opportunity to think of ourselves in relationship with the past, to put the public debate in a more historical perspective. And this is more or less the kind of approach I'm going to use in my talk. So, history in a time of crisis. first of all, we have to place the question of the public history in a more general framework, the framework of history, of course. You all know, well, this is one of the questions of doing history in a virtual environment. Well, you don't know exactly which type of audience you are talking to. So I don't know exactly who you are, but many of you may be students, maybe historians, maybe history lovers, people working in somehow with history. So I think most of you are aware of how complicated doing history has been, how it's changed in terms of production of history, communication, consumption. Everything has gone, almost everything has gone online. Libraries are closed, archives are closed. It's not possible to go to the university or to a research institute to do research and to disseminate research outcomes. In this context, it's not only it's more difficult, but we all had to change the way we communicate. We look at the sources, looking for sources online, and or asking friends and colleagues for electronic version of the sources, but also communicating online. So what? One example of this public history consumption in this context is given by virtual environment, virtual visits in museums. This is an example taken by the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, which is a great museum, which I visited pretty recently. It is recent. It was opened in 2017. And of course, virtual visit is not like a real visit of a museum, but it's better than nothing. So we are all thinking of possible replacement, possible substitutions. But of course, the entire environment, entire public history community is in turmoil and trying to restructure the way to work. One example of this is given by this ad, which is appeared just really a few days ago on the website of the National Council of Public History, which is the most important association for public history, was born in the US really a long time ago, as early as 1979, to help the public history community. So how can you produce public history in a time of crisis? There is, of course, crowdsourcing. So you have people giving some help, different types of help in gathering the sources, collecting the sources, and you do it online. You do it in a virtual environment because it's impossible to go physically in a place. You cannot have interviews, for example. You cannot go and meet people with a microphone and a camera, but you can do all these activities online. You can get videos, you can get photos, you can get emails. These memorial websites is just an example because of where you can send the memories in the form of videos or audios or pictures with almost no limitation of topic, upon condition that they are memory of people born before 1950. So the idea is gathering the memory of people who at some point are going to disappear. And I choose it as an example because it's one of the most important ones. So much so that there are different versions of the websites in different parts of the world, as you can see, from German to Spain, from Japan to Greece. And of course, you can do crowdsourcing in many different ways. You can ask for crowd-transcription. You put a document online, or most likely a series of documents online, and you ask someone else maybe living in some other part of the world, because of course this is entirely doing online, to transcribe the document. And this is a very successful form of participation in a work of public history. You may wonder, why should I work for free for someone else without getting any sort of payment or any sort of official recognition? Well, this is the Transcription Center of the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. It's a huge institution, research institute, and museum of science, history, and culture. The Transcription Center has had so far more than 21,000 volunteers, just to get an idea of to what extent the people who want to contribute, take part in the research, and take part in collaborative projects. Crowd tagging, that's another opportunity. You don't know how, you're not very good at paleography, you don't know how to transcribe 19th century documents. Fine, you can look at a picture and try to identify the people in it. Or you can take part in a crowd-curated exhibition. This is a wonderful example, because the crowdsourcing, the involvement of the people was done at 3 different levels. First of all, the people sent the photos. This was about the recent history of Brooklyn in New York. The people sent the photo, and then the photos were selected by the people themselves. So it's a very clear form of shared authority, where the organizers try to give as much power as possible to the public, to people who were just interested without getting any sort of official qualification to do that work. Selection of the photos, more than 300 people took part in it. And then the third stage, another selection after the exhibition was already open, after the photos had been displayed, in order to decide which photos had to be kept and which photos had to be removed. So this is just to give you an example. All of these things could have been said before January 2020. They are not necessarily related to the COVID-19 emergency, but are important to give you an idea of the context in which the connection between public history and coronavirus grew up. Public history, crowdsourcing, and people who wants to share their memory, which is the case of Memoro, and want to take part in history projects, especially related to the local community. So, when addressing the question of the relationship of the current time of crisis and public history, I want to focus on 2 aspects that I find particularly interesting. One aspect is the historical perspective. So one thing is just living in the coronavirus context. Another thing is apply to this exceptional moment we are living in a more historical perspective. So this is exactly what is suggested by this slide. The fact that a series of people began to be interested in books on past pandemics. So people began to realize that this is not the first pandemic, and unfortunately there have been others, which also was useful to put things in perspective. You can look back at the Spanish flu in 1918. You can look back at the Black Death in 1347 and onwards, and try to get some information. Time to try to compare. Try to put things in perspective. This is just a possible example. I'm sorry. Probably you can't see the slides very well, but there is one statistics about the death toll and different epidemics, where you realize that the number of COVID victims is much smaller than many other pandemics, which of course, it does not mean that this is not a big tragedy. This is not a consolation because many people have died in another context. But it helps you to look back at the future and see, okay, that epidemic, those epidemics have finished. What happened? How did they finish? What happened later? And these are the questions that people and the media began to ask. There is another stat on the two red circles on the fact that the death related to the coronavirus surpassed those for the Vietnam War. So lots of articles such as these ones began to appear in newspapers. Headlines related to the lesson that we can learn from the past, related to the fact that history can teach us a lesson, refer to different contexts, of course, because they were written by historians working in different fields, medieval historians, ancient historians, or modern, but and asking different questions. I've read an article, for example, establishing a connection based on the idea of hate campaign. The idea that starting from the 1630 plague in Milan, the one told of by Alessandro Manzoni in The Betrothed, the Promessi Sposi, and the hate campaign about the supposed greasers, the plague spreaders, doesn't existed. Just the idea of finding an enemy to put the blame of a pandemic that could not be explained. And now we see, for example, Trump putting the blame on China or on the Greens or on the communists. But there were different types of parallels based on, for example, on the reaction of the people, looking back at 1314 or the Antonine Plague in 165 AD, for example, and trying to find an answer to some questions. Will the people become more selfish or more empathic after going through these terrible times? Or would people rely more on religion or more on science? And so on. The economic consequences, for example. What is going to happen? And parallels. And of course, all these parallels has to be taken with a pinch of salt. But at the same time, I had the feeling that history, at least for a moment, had once again a major role in the public debate. History, we all know, history is often neglected because it's not considered to be useful. It's considered to be less practical than other subjects that, for example, students can still study at universities. But I had the feeling that many people in this context tried to find, asked history to find some answers to questions that they were not able to answer to. Some questions that maybe science is not understandably enough, is not able to answer yet. People looked at history, I think, for one main reason. The main reason why people want to look back at those past epidemics is that they all ended. So it's pretty much reassuring to see, okay, it's already happened, but somehow it took a while, but it's going to finish. So this is what I meant when I was interested in focusing on this aspect of putting the public debate of COVID-19 in a more historical perspective, which of course doesn't have to be pushed too far. Okay, there were so many titles saying we learn from the future, we compare, look what happened in 1919, look what happened in the Middle Ages. That at some point a different type of headlines began to appear. These types of headlines. Okay, compare with caution. The past is not prediction, which is of course important. One thing is saying that historia is magistra vitae. Well, this is what Cicero allegedly said, but it was not exactly the same thing. But of course, history can teach us something, but we also need to historicize. We also need to put things in historical perspective, understand that every context is different. What happened in, let's say, Milan in 1630, it's not exactly, the context is not exactly the same of Milan in 2020. So, well, this is, of course, this is an important clarification, but nevertheless, I think the question of the historical perspective is important and needs to be kept in mind. Apart from that, there is another message that came out from the media. So the public, once again, the public debate on the COVID and in a historical perspective. This time not looking back at the past, but looking forward to the future. The message was more or less, you are in history. You are living in an exceptional moment, in an extraordinary moment. This is a sentence that I found in an Italian journal and said by the Italian Ministry of Education and University, Lucia Solina, addressing the students taking the final examination and secondary school. Of course, this is the most normal of action. Every year there are thousands of students taking the exam, the final examination before going to the university or working. And but something that used to be normal this year is special. This year is going to be in history books, because in such an extraordinary context, the exceptional is the new normal, and the normal is the new exceptional. The normal is the new exceptional because something you do every time is exceptional. Doing shopping is normal, but when you do it because all the cities in lockdown, you have no food, you stay in line for 2 hours, you go there with the mask, the gel, and the gloves. This is exceptional. And the exceptional is the new normal, because wearing a mask is exceptional. Most of us have probably done it just for Halloween. And now we do it every day if we want to just to cross the street to reach the rubbish bin. So the world is changing. This is an extraordinary moment, and this is why there is this message repeated by the media again and again. You are in history, or you can be in history. So this is another type of message coming out from newspapers, from the internet, referring to what? Referring to projects, referring to a number of projects that came out in recent times in the last 2 or 3 months, trying to get a sense of this tragedy in a historical perspective. Become part of history. Be part of history. Sorry. And believe me, this was the same all over the world, because these headlines come from, there is the Austin, US, of course, the Smithsonian, Washington, DC, the Churchill Archives are in Cambridge, the Redford Archive is in Australia, the tree photo comes from Thailand, from Malaysia, sorry. So the same message all over the world. But how can you become part of history? You can become part of history being involved in one of these public history projects. And this is another interesting aspect I want to mention today. To be part of history is taking a selfie being part of history, of course not. But at the same time, this selfie, like any other photo, any other memory, any other document related to the life we are living in these exceptional circumstances, can actually become somehow part of history. First of all, we have to keep in mind one thing, that we have to put individual memories in historical perspective. So I'll take this example from really everyday life of many of us. You take a photo, as we just said, you put it on the social media, you comment it, and that's it. Then the same photo pops up 2 years later, as in this case. I'm not sure you can read it all, but Facebook tell us, yes, this is from 2 years later. 2 years ago. You want to make a post, you comment it, you immediately establish a relationship between now and then, between 2 years ago, the photo you took, the post you wrote, and the moment you're living at the moment. So you may comment about the differences between the two. You may comment that your son was younger than it is, that it was a better moment than it is now, or the other way around. You might have been living in a different town or having a different job, and when you establish, even in your mind, but also more so if you write a new post, you establish a relationship of this individual memory with your present, and that memory becomes public and is put in a historical perspective. But of course, this is not history yet. What do you need to move from an individual memory to history? Well, first of all, you have to put together individual memories. Lots of individual memories can make a collective memory. Look at these jigsaw pieces. Every jigsaw piece is different shape, different colors. But when you put them together, you can get a completely different picture. And this is exactly what happens with individual memories. One thing is individual memory. Even each of them is worth. Each of them can be important, but you don't get the general picture. Then, of course, if you have a collective memory, you add to it the interpretation, the work the historian does on memory, on sources, trying to select the sources as much as possible, understanding as much as possible what is reliable and what is not. Historicize the memories, because you have to put them in their historical context, connected to what was going on at the moment, how people were living, and so on. And then this is the passage which allows you to move from the level of the individual memories to history. You may ask, what is the connection between all these questions and COVID-19? Well, there are plenty of projects related to COVID-19, which moves from individual memories with the aim of building the future history. This is an amazing map, which can be navigated, containing plenty of projects, not all of them, unfortunately, plenty of projects on public history projects, on the memory bank projects, basically, on how people are living in the context of COVID-19. The map is provided by two associations made by us and the International Federation for Public History in the person of Thomas Coven. And really, it is amazing to navigate it and to discover different projects. But of course, it was impossible to put together all the projects because there are so many all over the world, probably many more than you can think. And let's go and take a look to some of them, just to get an idea of what they're trying to do, and especially what their aims are in terms of building the history of the future. Because here they are trying to connect with the future, collecting material for future historians. Coronarchiv, this comes from 3 German universities, Bochum, Hamburg, and Gießen. And the idea is, once again, it's in the headline, becoming part of history. And there is the stress on top-down history, on the refusal of the model of the top-down history, trying to write a bottom-up, use a bottom-up approach, gathering different sources from normal people, everyday life, and in the future, connecting all these individual memories. They are gathering everything that is digitized or digital. Not only videos, photos, pictures, but emails, newspapers, and so on. And this is, it's as I said, a German project, but it grew up, and this is the English-speaking version, the Coronarchiv, rather than Coronarchiv. Another project is Archive 404, which is interesting because of the name. You all know that 404 is the page you reach when you look for a missing page on the internet. The idea behind this project is that the coronavirus period is going to be a missing page in our memory. Because at some point we will think back to spring, summer, whatever, hopefully not much more. 2020, we'll ask ourselves what we did. What did you do for summer 2020? Nothing, because I wasn't locked down. Hopefully not, of course, but situations are different from one country to another. Or where did you spend your birthday in spring 2020? Nowhere, because I was in lockdown, I was at home, I couldn't do anything. Which conference did you go in spring, summer 2020? And the answer is always the same. So this is going to be a missing page. And for this reason, the Center for Urban History in Lviv, Ukraine, is trying to collect these memories with an explicit aim of historic comprehension. So all these projects I've chosen have a very explicit historical understanding. This project is based on a connection between a picture, an audio, and a text. It's created by Michael Frisch, who is a big name of public history and oral history. He's the author of an important book on shared authority, and he's emeritus professor at the University of Buffalo, New York. One of the things that I found interesting in this project, and this picture in particular, is that we can look at situations that are normal seen with our 2020 eyes, but not necessarily easy to explain if seen in a different perspective. Why are these people in Canada in February talking outside rather than meeting in a house? We all know that this is something normal in the coronavirus context. But of course, it's difficult to understand why all these people are talking and meeting outside. They're probably freezing. They're keeping distance between each other, and so on. Another project is a Bridgeport History Center in Connecticut, and again, there is an explicit reference to the historians of the future but also normal people who in the future will try to understand what happened. And once again, an explicit reference to the fact that you can be part of history. And well, I'm going pretty quickly because there are many projects, there are so many things to do, but the time is limited. Making history, Jackson Hole Historical Society and Museum in Wyoming. And once again, the idea is making history. Doing what? Doing something special? Of course, no. Just telling what you were doing when you were at home, wearing your mask in lockdown, and finding difficult to buy food, for example, and all of these things. And of course, the idea of normal people doing history is not completely new. Since the 60s and the 70s and the last century, social history is telling us the history, is telling us that also the normal people, common people, has a role in history. Not just heads of state and the captains and explorers, but this is normal people in a very exceptional circumstances. So it's of course a different matter. This is another very interesting project, and I'm very happy to mention it because Frédéric Claver from CTDH at the University of Luxembourg is going to be one of our speakers in this summer camp. Unfortunately, his class is going to be restricted, but still, I'm sure we will hear more about his project, which pushes forward the idea of the crowdsourcing, because in this case, the crowdsourcer is unaware. You don't have necessarily to contribute voluntarily. Of course, there is nothing wrong. It's all anonymous, but Claveret and his team is studying the tweets on coronavirus. You go on Twitter and you see what people is talking about and when in relation to the coronavirus. But there are also other elements that can be added. Cooking in the Past, for example, it's an interesting project based in Montreal and Toronto because also because it's not based in a university and founded by a member of the academia, by an historian working at the university or something like that. It was done by a school teacher. But also because rather than establishing a connection with the future, it establishes a connection with the past. You are in lockdown, you cook, you think, you look back to your past, and maybe you grab a recipe coming from your past. So this is really interesting because in this case, people are not working for a historian of the future, we call it like this, but it's time to establish a personal connection with their own past. So it's really interesting for this, apart from the recipes, of course. This is also interesting because it's not a virtual project. We are in Coventry, UK, Coventry University. This is not virtual because a number of sketchbooks, actually 2021 sketchbooks, material, physical sketchbooks were given to people working, living or playing in Coventry. This is what the project says, in order to sketch something, write, draw, with the aim of displaying all this material, not online, as most of the other projects do, but in a physical exhibition. Also taking the opportunity by the fact that in 2021, Coventry will be the city capital of culture. So this is interesting because it has nothing to do with the internet, and well, the aim also is, I think, to demonstrate that it's possible to do something physical, even in a lockdown context. And this is the last one I want to show you because this is the funniest one of all. We want your hair. I don't know if you already had your hair cut after waiting maybe for a long time because of the lockdown. But this is the idea of this team, and this is in Tyne, and not too far from Newcastle upon Tyne in UK. The idea grew up from the fact that 2 days ago, 4th of July, barbers and hairdressers reopened in the UK. And so this museum is actually collecting physical hair of the people cutting their hair. You can think whatever you want about it, but just to get a sense of the fact that people is trying to preserve their memories. All the more so because people consider more important to preserve their memories in a time of crisis. In a time of crisis, well, on the one hand, maybe you want just to forget what happened and move on, but on the other hand, you realize it's an exceptional moment and you want to preserve the memory of it, whatever it is, because it's not going to repeat it, because you will tell your grandchildren about it. This is what I do. I mean, when I saw that I'm from Rome, it doesn't snow very often. When I saw that the snow, the real snow, heavy snow fall for the first time, just went and grabbed my camera, went out and took a lot of photos because I was aware that it would not happen, well, anytime soon at least. So this is the idea, preserving the memories. But of course, one of the objections that have been raised that this is present, this is not history. It's present history. Okay, let's take a look at these photos. I hope you can see them. The first one on the left was taken at Camp Funston in Kansas in 1918, the second one in Wuhan in 2020. Well, what's the difference? Of course, two different places, but this is not relevant. The scenario is more or less the same. The real difference is the date. So we do think that the 1981 is the 1981, yes, is an historical document because 100 years have passed, 102 years have passed. So the question here is that a normal photo, a normal email, a normal document, when you approach it in a different time, can be an historical document. Can be 10 years, 50 years, 200 years, whatever, but it acquires a different meaning. And of course, there's nothing strange in writing the history at the time it is happening. Thucydides, for example, is considered the father of the scientific history. He wrote the War of Peloponnesus, one of the most famous historical works. When the war was happening, he actually started writing his book shortly after the war broke out. And but nobody would say it's not an historical document, not because he's a historian, but because I work on Renaissance Florence. One of the main sources of Renaissance Florence is diary written by an apothecary, Luca Landucci. So he was not a historian, but he left a document on what was happening in Florence at the time. That is a very important document today in order to understand how the life in the city was. Okay, so we're moving towards the conclusion, and well, of course, there are many questions that can be asked, can be raised. Who are people contributing? Why? Who is the project addressed to? So, of course, people want to give their own contribution, especially in a context of lockdown. People want to preserve their memory, all the more so because it's a time of crisis. And also people is happy to share. One thing is writing a memory and put it in your diary, in your drawer. Another thing is sharing it with people. Otherwise, social network would not exist. People is happy to share and is happy to give their contribution to historical reconstruction. This is why the Transcription Center, the Smithsonian Institute, has more than 21,000 volunteers. So, who is this project? Who is the project addressed to? This is another question we can ask for each one of the projects we have seen and for all the others. Well, most of the projects are addressed to a specific group of people. Most of them are addressed to local communities. You do a project in a small town in Wyoming, you want to collect memories or documents from the small town in Wyoming. It's understandable. It's not easy to put up a project like Memor, trying to get memories from all over the world. And but not all the limitation of the projects are based on a geographical delimitation. There are, for example, there was a project on parenting during the coronavirus emergency, getting contribution from parents with children, very small children in any part of the world. So different perspective, but sometimes connected to the location, connected to the geographical context, but not necessarily that. Where most of these projects are located in North America and Europe, but not all of them. Of course, it would be good to see more projects from Africa, for example, or from Asia. Maybe there are some projects that are more difficult to reach, also for problem of language, but it's understandable that in some areas that's more difficult to put up these types of projects, also to think of such enterprises than in others. Also because you need to have the technical equipment, which can be an issue, which is not to be taken for granted for everyone. The last question is, what are we going to do with all these projects? We are collecting an incredible amount of material, amazing material, but collecting is not enough. This material need to be studied. When? By whom? In some case, the material is shown on the website immediately. In some cases, it isn't. It is collected, it is stored, and one day will be shown, or one day will be studied. But this is not an easy answer. I'm, well, running out of time, so I don't think I'm going to go in depth in this. But of course, this is a question that needs to be answered. My last slide is devoted to a sentence that I find extremely interesting and also gives sense, a little bit more sense to all these initiatives of public history in a time of crisis. In an era of uncertainty, the presence of an archive can comfort us, make us feel like we've made a contribution to a group we care about. What we need to bear in mind more than ever before is the nature of history and how we shape it with every screenshot and record of our actions. I like this sentence in itself, but also for two more reasons, because it's not written by a historian, so there were no agents, specific interests in saying that history is important. This is the Internet Governance Coordinator at the Council of Europe, so something who really works on the role of the Internet and communication within the European community. And it was written back in 2007, so it's not directly related to the COVID emergency. And I take it as some sort of call for responsibility. The fact that what we do is somehow preserved, is somehow collected, even without the project maybe, and that our actions are going somehow to compose a more general picture. You remember the the jigsaw pieces. So it might be seen as some sort of connection between the role of history, but also social change and social responsibility. And I think it is an idea which gives sense to this project that we've seen, also the connection between public and private, the sense that our private can be public, and we need to be aware of it. It's interesting that public history is, in this case, often done it through private channels because the public spaces don't exist anymore when there is a lockdown and it's impossible to go out. And this is more or less the conclusion I wanted to give to this general talk about public history and times of crisis, in a time of crisis, and maybe we have a few more minutes for further discussion. Thank you very much for listening.